ignited. Next slide, please. The Workforce Data Quality Campaign is a foundation-funded nonprofit, and we're dedicated to promoting inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant data systems. So to break that down a little bit, we advocate for data systems that contain data about participants across all of the state's education, workforce program, and social service programs. These data systems will allow data to be matched across all those programs so that we can follow students through their education, and they're going to incorporate information that shows how participants perform in the labor market. Next slide, please. We're very grateful to our national partners who make our work possible, one of whom is National Skills Coalition. We are actually a project of the National Skills Coalition, and so my colleague Katie Spiker and I are actually going to alternate between our slides and our voices somewhat intermittently, because that'll make things easier for you guys all to understand. So just be aware that that is happening. Next slide, please. And Katie, please take it away.
Thanks, Jenna. National Skills Coalition, as a bit of an introduction, is a DC-based advocacy organization that focuses on expanding access to middle-skill jobs for all workers. Middle-skill jobs are jobs that require more than a high school diploma but less than a 4-year degree. And we know that moving forward, 54% of job openings are going to be in these jobs, but only 44% of workers are trained at that level. Moving on to the next slide. One key strategy that we use at National Skills Coalition to help and advocate for at NSC to help close this middle skill gap is apprenticeship. As a bit of an introduction, apprenticeship is an earn and learn model where workers are exposed to both on-the-job training as well as classroom training-related instruction. Generally, this process of earning and learning lasts of a period from 1 to 6 years, generally around 3 to 4. Over this time period, an apprentice receives usually around 2,000 hours of on-the-job training, and at the end of the process, an apprentice receives an industry-recognized credential. Moving on to the next slide. We know that there's a number of benefits associated with apprenticeship for both employers and apprentices. For apprentices, apprenticeship is related to increased earnings as much as $300,000 over a career that apprentices earn more than non-apprentices. As we discussed in the previous slide, it's also associated with skill attainment, the access to a career pathway, and credential attainment for the apprentice. For employers, and you'll hear Deb speak a little bit more about this later, it's associated with higher employee retention. It gives employers access to creating their own customized training program and developing a predictable talent pipeline. And it's also been associated with increased productivity. Moving on to the next slide. And with all of these benefits, we know that employers support apprenticeship. 94% of employers who have apprenticeship programs would recommend these as a strategy to other employers. I'll turn the slides back over to Jenna to talk a little bit more about governance and apprenticeship data.
Yes, thank you so much, Katie. Next slide, please. So it's somewhat important to note for this presentation that there are 2 types of apprenticeship programs, registered apprenticeships and non-registered apprenticeships. So the data that state and federal governments have about programs depends upon the type of apprenticeship. Next slide, please. As it turns out, there is no data available about non-registered apprenticeships and less quality control mechanisms. So for the rest of this presentation, we'll be discussing only the registered apprenticeship program. In fact, we actually don't know how many non-registered apprenticeship programs exist in the United States or how many apprentices they serve. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, in this presentation, we'll be discussing only the registered apprenticeship program. So to give you some background about what that is, in order to become a registered apprenticeship program, either the U.S. Department of Labor or a state apprenticeship agency which is designated by the U.S. Department of Labor, they're going to evaluate these apprenticeship programs and certify that they meet certain national standards. So the Department of Labor directly administers registered apprenticeship programs in 25 states. In the 25 other states in the District of Columbia, they're registered by the state apprenticeship agencies. So the federally The federal standards are outlined in the Code of Federal Regulations. There's 23 of them. I am not going to go through all 23 of them with you today, but just to give you a vague idea of what some of these standards are. The Registered Apprenticeship Program, in order to become registered, will have to outline the process for on-the-job training and related instruction. They'll have to have an approved type of apprenticeship program, so these can be based on the number of hours spent in training, achieving certain competencies or a mixture thereof. They have to provide at least a minimum wage at the beginning and then gradually increasing wages as the apprentice gains more skills. There should be qualified trainers and adequate supervision, and then, of course, safe equipment and facilities. In addition, these programs have to be in one of about 950 apprenticeable occupations, and they need to follow rules that forbid discrimination in the recruitment, selection, employment, and training of apprentices because of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. Finally, there are certain affirmative action procedures that a registered apprenticeship program will have to follow. So they have to identify and actively recruit and motivate present and potential underrepresented apprentices. The final kind of key defining characteristic of the registered apprenticeship program is that all people that finish the program receive a certificate of completion at the end. Next slide, please. So, unfortunately, there's no comprehensive repository of apprenticeship data in the United States. That said, there are two kind of main places where you can find data about the registered apprenticeship program. A place with most data on most registered apprenticeship programs is the Registered Apprenticeship Partners Information Data System, also called RAPIDS. However, as we're going to see kind of in the rest of this presentation, the data in RAPIDS depends based upon the governance structure of the state. So RAPIDS doesn't have the same data about apprenticeship programs in every state. A handful of states also have data kept in their longitudinal data systems. So for those of you that are less familiar with what that is, a longitudinal data system is operated by the state, and it matches data from different sources and contains information about individuals over time. So with a longitudinal data system, you can follow a student from K-12 maybe into a workforce program, see as they get a job, go back to a two-year school, and then go back out into the workforce. And ultimately, they help us to see what combinations of programs are helping residents. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the data that's in RAPIDS depends upon the governance structure of the state's apprenticeship program. So RAPIDS has individual level data from the 25 state programs that are administered by the Department of Labor, as well as 9 state programs that are administered by state apprenticeship agencies. So individual level data that's in RAPIDS, you can see on the map, will be in dark and light blue. The other 16 states plus the District of Columbia send only aggregate level data to the Department of Labor every quarter. These states are on the map in orange. Aggregate data is basically, it's not data about the individuals or the individual programs, it's summaries. It's summary about data of all of the apprentices and all of the apprenticeship programs in that state. Next slide, please. So the individual level data in RAPIDS from the states that include that information includes data about both apprentices and apprenticeship programs. The apprentice data is data about the demographics of apprentices, the level of education that they attained before joining the apprenticeship program, their contact information, and their enrollment status. So whether they have completed the program, have just enrolled, etc. The data about apprenticeship programs in RAPIDS includes how long the program provides on-the-job instruction, who's providing the related instruction, an ID number of the employer that's employing the apprentice, and then how much money apprentices make throughout the process, their beginning, ending wages, wages in the middle, and finally the type of apprenticeship program, including if it involves one or more employers or if it's covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Next slide, please. The aggregate data in RAPIDS which exists for 16 states in the District of Columbia, includes data also about apprentices and programs, but as you'll notice, it's quite different from the individual level data, and I'll kind of go into this more later, but it creates a problem when we're trying to compare apprenticeship programs across the states because we just don't have the same data to work from. So the aggregate data about apprentices is how many apprentices are served in the state's apprenticeship programs, how many completion certificates are issued in the state, the average starting and ending wages, as well as demographic information. The data about programs includes how many active programs exist in the state, how many employers those programs serve, and how many programs are competency-based or time-based or some mixture thereof. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, also only a handful of states keep apprenticeship data in their longitudinal data systems. This includes, of course, North Carolina, who we are very happy to have on this webinar today and who can talk to you more about how they got apprenticeship data and what they're doing with it. It also includes Hawaii, Michigan, Nebraska, Texas, and Washington. Many states that have longitudinal databases receive Workforce Data Quality Initiative grants from the U.S. Department of Labor, and these are intended to enhance state workforce longitudinal databases. The grants don't actually require states to include apprenticeship data in their systems, but they do encourage it. So we hope that moving forward, more states will figure out how to get this data into their system and really start doing research with it. Next slide, please. So as I've described, the apprenticeship data layout is not ideal. The main problem is that there's no comprehensive centralized database. While Rapids does have information about most programs, it varies. On some, it's individual level, on some, it's aggregate, and it just makes it very difficult to compare programs from across the different states, and it makes it difficult to conduct research and even benchmarking. Another large problem with apprenticeship data is that it's not all publicly accessible. The Department of Labor does post some statistics about apprenticeship programs on its website. That's one page. But we really think that it would be great if potential apprentices or employers, the sponsors that are creating apprenticeship programs, had some sort of user-friendly version of this data where they could do their own research, and perhaps a potential apprentice could look at something that is not an Excel spreadsheet, which wouldn't be easy to understand, but maybe a graph or a chart or something like that where they can say, what are my outcomes going to be in these various apprenticeship programs? What's the best option for me? Next slide, please. So we don't have all the answers, unfortunately, to improving the landscape of apprenticeship data, but we do have some suggestions about metrics that we think could be really useful to keep about registered apprenticeship programs, particularly if the data is ever collected about all registered apprenticeship programs across the 50 states and DC. So the first one of those is credential attainment. And this includes not just the certificates issued to graduates of apprenticeship programs, but also credentials more broadly. So this could include licenses, diplomas, or certificates that apprentices earn before or after their apprenticeship. And that would also help align apprenticeship laws with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Another really important thing to measure would be employment outcomes. We can track, if we can track whether apprentices are retaining employment over time with the employer that's sponsoring their apprenticeship, that helps us figure out if employers are finding apprentices finding qualified workers after they graduate. And I mean, usually employers are hiring an apprentice for a specific hiring need. So that speaks a lot to how apprenticeship is valuing employers. And of course, Deb can talk more about this later. It's also going to help us figure out whether apprentices are employed in the industry, whether apprentices, if they ever move on to employment after their initial apprenticeship in a different organization, stay in the same industry and occupation, and it would show if they have market relevant skills. Wages are also important because they show whether apprentices are being paid a fair wage during the apprenticeship and a family sustaining wage after the completion of the apprenticeship. If we have wages at various time intervals, and that's going to show us whether graduates are able to obtain gradually increasing wages throughout their careers. Outcomes are also a really important measure, or outcomes by demographic, excuse me, are a really important measure because they help ensure that all of our participants in an apprenticeship program are achieving similar results and that our programs are equitable. As I discussed earlier, the federal regulations place a really strong focus on equitable programs, and so that's something that we would want to be sure to measure by collecting demographic information and measuring outcomes by demographic. Finally, employer return on investment. There's currently some studies underway about the value of apprentices to employers, but we believe that these programs are probably going to be valuable to employers. And again, Deb can talk about this. We know it's been valuable for her. They can save money on wages because employers are paying less to someone in training than they would someone that's already been trained, and they ensure that an employer finds qualified employees that receive tailored training to what they're going to be doing at that particular company. And so showing if these employers ultimately increase an employer's bottom line is going to show if apprenticeships are useful to employers and can promote employers to start new apprenticeship programs. So I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Katie. Next slide, please. Katie, take it away.
Thanks, Jenna. So building on some of the benefits of apprenticeship we discussed earlier, while there are leaps and bounds to go in some of the data tracking, the administration and Congress have been interested in apprenticeship and have taken steps to help expand apprenticeship across the country. Over the past year, the administration has invested in the American Apprenticeship Initiative last fall $175 million to 46 grantees. These are expected to result in 34,000 new apprenticeship slots across the country. The American Apprenticeship Initiative, one of the main purposes of this strategy was to help expand apprenticeship to new industries and new occupations, building on some of the success that labor has historically had in the apprenticeship model. The administration has also launched the Registered Apprenticeship College Consortium, a joint Department of Labor and Department of Education effort that's aligning the skills attained through an apprenticeship with college credit, leading to post-secondary credential attainment. In the President's FY 2017 budget, there were also a number of requests for apprenticeship-focused investments, $2 billion for an apprenticeship training fund, and $90 million apprenticeship grant proposal, which would build on some of the action that Congress took last year. Next slide, please. So in 2016, Congress appropriated $90 million of funds to help expand apprenticeship. The Department of Labor has announced their intention to spend these funds. $9.5 million will be spent on accelerator state grants, which are estimated to be awarded later at the end of this month, maybe at this point next month. And these are intended for state planning in order to develop innovative approaches to expand apprenticeship at the state level. Once states have received these awards and had the opportunities to plan and develop the innovative ideas, then DOL is launching another round of grants for $52 million in leader state grants designed for these states to implement those innovative practices. And finally, they anticipate releasing $28.5 million in contracts to help complement this state work. And this would build on some of the expansions to apprenticeship in the American Apprenticeship Grants that would really help scale apprenticeship to new industries and to build up the representation of underrepresented workers right now. Moving on to the next slide. In addition to some of the funding legislation last year, there's additional legislation in Congress right now. So the EARNS Act, which I'll talk more about on the next slide, was introduced earlier this month by Senators Murray and Hatch. There's also two tax proposal bills. The LEAP Act and the Apprenticeship and Job Training Act would provide tax credits for employers who are creating or expanding apprenticeship programs. Moving on to the next slide. The EARNS Act would provide funding for expanding apprenticeship, building on the $90 million that Congress appropriated for FY 2016. It would provide $75 million in funding for increasing awareness of both pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship, with the pre-apprenticeship strategies focused largely on expanding opportunities for underrepresented populations. It would also provide $5 million in funding for aligning with post-secondary education, institutionalizing the Registered Apprenticeship and College Consortium that the administration launched earlier. And it would provide $20 million in funding for subsidies to new sponsors of apprenticeship programs to help alleviate some of the costs we know that are associated with starting and growing apprenticeship programs. The EARNS Act also requires DOL to track some data. It requires them to track employment outcomes, post-secondary attainment, and also look into return on investments and other effectiveness measures. So it would address some of the concerns that Jenna discussed, but still would not require complete measurement of all the data metrics. So I'll turn it back over to Jenna to introduce the folks from North Carolina.
Thank you, Katie. So next we would like to introduce Pamela Howes and Betty McGrath from the North Carolina Department of Commerce. We're really excited to have them on. They're going to talk a little bit about their organization, North Carolina's apprenticeship program, their apprenticeship data, how they got it, and what they're doing with it. So Pamela and Betty, take it away. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pamela Howes, and Betty thought it was worth mentioning that I actually joined Commerce a year and a half ago. I came from the private sector where I actually started a youth apprenticeship and an adult apprenticeship program for Siemens Energy in Charlotte, North Carolina. So next slide, please. So NCWorks is North Carolina's workforce system. We administer services out of our NCWorks career centers across the state. And I think it's interesting to mention that in 2014, the apprenticeship program was actually moved from the State Department of Labor over to the State Department of Commerce. And so that's given us some different kinds of opportunities that I'll be glad to speak to later. So, of course, we want to have the best workforce in the country. We think that we already do, but we're doing a lot of work in the alignment and coordination with our community college partners, especially with apprenticeship, the University of North Carolina system, the Department of Public Instruction, which is our K-12 education system, and Department of Health and Human Services. And, of course, as all of us are, we are customer focused. We want to respond to the needs of our North Carolina citizens and our local economy, and prepare our workforce to succeed in the North Carolina economy, improve their skills so that we can build a sustainable pipeline into the private and public employer sectors. Next slide, please. So this is just basically an integration slide showing how we work with our other partners. So, of course, we have a wonderful university system in North Carolina. We also have an excellent K-12 system, which we're doing a lot with youth apprenticeship, our community college system, who are training a lot of our apprentices across the state, with our health and human services partners. We're working more and more with them to assist people with disabilities and other barriers into workforce programs. And then, of course, the Department of Commerce is where we actually do our workforce mission to make sure that our citizens can obtain gainful employment and to help our employers build a sustainable, qualified pipeline of workers. Next slide. I want to mention, so I actually had an opportunity to make this presentation to our state legislators a couple of months ago. They have recently become very, very interested in apprenticeships, specifically in the area of youth apprenticeships, in order to build a high-quality talent pipeline. And as of today, our legislature is in short session, and the House has proposed an additional $500,000 for the proposed budget for apprenticeships specifically. And we are waiting with bated breath because we know the Senate is going to propose a bill as well that would make community college tuition free for any youth apprentice that was going into an apprenticeship program right out of high school. So lots of exciting things are happening in North Carolina. Of course, you know, Katie and Jenna have already talked about what apprenticeship really does, but I think one of the things that we really stress to our employers is that high standard in instructional rigor with their related instruction. They can actually train their employees to do what they need for them to be able to do. One of the other things that moving apprenticeship from labor to commerce has really had us working on is integration with the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So we are currently working through a process in which we would check to see what apprentices were qualified for WIOA funds and enroll them in WIOA programs, because we feel like that's going to offset the cost of the apprenticeship program for our employers, because that money could be used for uniforms, tooling, child care, transportation, those sorts of things. I also want to mention that we are also a state approving apprenticeship agency, as Katie and Jenna talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So, of course, we provide services to businesses through our NCWorks career centers. We work very closely with our employers to identify skill gaps that they're having. We know a lot of our employees are having a very difficult time finding technical qualified workers for their talent pipelines. So we're really working closely with them to develop our comprehensive programs to train their employees. We can actually speak to, the most popular apprenticeship programs in North Carolina, and to connect our employers with related instruction providers. As I mentioned before, our community college system is a very robust system. We have 58 colleges throughout the state of North Carolina, and they are a wonderful integrated partner with us, especially with our state apprenticeship programs. And of course, we also can recruit, screen, and test potential apprentices, and you'll hear from Deb Linder later on the call. She is one of our HR managers in North Carolina that is a partner with the Guilford Apprenticeship Partners, which is specifically a youth apprenticeship program that's brand new, starting out of the gates this year. They're getting ready to offer their pre-apprentices summer employment with 5 advanced manufacturers in the Guilford County area. And we have developed a recruiting, screening, and testing model for those youth apprentices to make sure that they are able to handle the academic rigor of the program. And of course, we create and register those programs with the Department of Labor, and we monitor and audit all of our apprenticeship programs very closely. Next slide, please. So a voluntary system of employer-driven training, of course, they have to have an approved plan. There always has to be an OJT component, related instruction, typically technical training, defined training hours. Betty's going to talk some about wage scale progression, which we have some pretty impressive numbers in North Carolina. All of our apprenticeship agreements are voluntary in the state. The wage rates typically begin at half of the journeyman rate on the national level, and then of course they progress in their wages as the apprentice works through the OJT and key competencies related to their apprenticeship program. And then the successful completion, of course, they receive not only state certificate from the Department of Commerce, but they also really receive the National Journeyman Certificate from the U.S. Department of Labor. Next slide, please. So we actually have a very robust apprenticeship council in North Carolina, and that membership is comprised of several of our partners, such as the North Carolina Community College System, our Department of Public Instruction, and then many of our bigger employers that have very robust apprenticeship programs. And they actually issue rules and regulations for program operation. We meet quarterly. It's a very active group. We've actually, the Apprenticeship Council has been so popular that we have actually created regional teams throughout the state of North Carolina to work on apprenticeship in each of those local regions. And of course, always collaborating with our community colleges. We know today that we have about 130 youth apprentices that started their apprenticeship in high school that are using the community college for their related instruction. So we're tracking that very closely, and we're putting many systems in place to really recruit and test and screen more youth apprentices. It's becoming very popular with our employers. We actually have 11 public-private partnerships throughout the state of North Carolina, specifically with youth apprenticeship programs, and we're seeing much more interest in growing youth apprenticeship in North Carolina. Of course, we have a very diverse group of industries and a very diverse group of occupations, both public and private sector. We have had challenges in the past. As we went through the recession, we saw that you know, our numbers went down, our state funding was cut for apprenticeship, but I'm happy to say we're seeing the exact opposite today. And as a result of that, we're seeing about a 35% increase in the number of apprentices today than the number of apprentices that we had 1 year ago in North Carolina. So I think that decline is going the other way now. We're seeing a lot of positive growth in the program. I also want to mention that we have a pretty robust apprenticeship program at Fort Bragg, which is our largest military installation in North Carolina with over 72 apprenticeable occupations. And we have a very active veterans in piping program down at our Marine base at Camp Lejeune. So we're doing lots of really neat things with veterans in apprenticeship. I also have the Veterans Employment Training Services for the state of North Carolina, so it really gives my two state directors for apprenticeship and vets an opportunity to collaborate and work together to get more of our veterans in apprenticeship training programs. So we are growing our employers every day that have apprenticeship programs, and we're growing our number of apprentices. And I'm going to turn this over to Betty.
Thank you, Pam. Thanks for having us today. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit. Now we're going to switch hats a little bit. And you heard a lot from Pam about our apprenticeship program and the great things that we are doing here in North Carolina. We're going to talk to you a little bit about how we are integrating the apprenticeship data into our workforce longitudinal data system. North Carolina has had a workforce longitudinal data system for many years, predates a lot of the other systems. Started as a voluntary effort and has grown extensively. It has been legislatively mandated, and it's housed within the Department of Commerce. Over the years, we've collected a lot of data, but one of our issues has been that our technology that's driving the system has been pretty dated. And we were lucky enough to receive a Workforce Data Quality Initiative grant and utilizing that money to enhance our system. And more recently, we started working about 2 years ago with a center called the Government Data Analytics Center, which has been set up within the Department of Information Technology here in North Carolina, and they're charged with integrating data across a wide variety of sectors within the state. And we are in the process of development of a new data warehouse for all of our data with a relational database structure and an analytical data mart on top of that. So if you go to the next slide, please. Want to just give you where we have a huge amount of data, which that sometimes it's a wealth of data, and then how do you migrate through all of the things that people are looking for to really do some great analytics. And so having data is great, but sometimes you have to start to apply really high level merging and analytics on top of it. We've got data on over 9.2 million unique individuals. We have over 219 million program records, 23 years of employment and wage data, over 15 years of industry, and we also have UI claims. One of the key things that we are mandated to do is to also keep a lot of the data confidential. It's very limited to even who has access to be able to touch the data, since we deal with a lot of data that is very confidential, including Social Security number and other PII-related data, and also FERPA-related data that we have got to maintain. So if you go to the next slide, one of our big initiatives that we've had to do is to work with our NCWorks partners on performance measures. Here's just a list. Here you can read it for yourself. Here's the big picture in terms of the data that we get from all of our contributors right now. We are expanding that. Part of our expansion that I talked about under our WDQI includes the expansion of further data elements from all of our contributors. But here's the list of elements that we currently get from all of our workforce programs, and then we're able to link it with our employment and wage data. So if you can move to the next slide. Just to give you a ballpark of the size and magnitude of our current repository, we have in the last 10 years data on over 6.6 million individuals who participate across a wide variety of our education and workforce agencies. As Pam talked about, the data that she deals with really comes under what is the Division of Workforce Solutions, which includes these data here. There's 3.2 million individuals, includes a lot of workforce programs which span from Wagner Pizer, Trade, WIA, WIOA, veterans programs, and of course our apprenticeship program. And you can see also we have a huge amount of data that's coming from our 58 campuses of our community college system. They've served over 3.2 million individuals in the last 10 years. Pretty expensive and expansive use of data across all of these sectors. We go to the next slide. Just to give you a big ballpark of the relationship of our education and workforce entities, we do it's a pretty simple set of analysis, but it's pretty powerful to show the big impacts. If you take those over 6 million people and you cross it with the current wage file, we had 4.8 million wage records, individuals in our wage file, and 62% of all of those wage earners have been participants of our education and workforce system in the last 10 years. Pretty powerful number when you can think of the employment in the state, and it shows kind of from a high level the impacts that we can have between our workforce and education and the state's economy. If you go to the next slide. So in addition to looking at the total number of workers in the state, and that is the individuals in the wage file, these individuals earned 47% of all wages in the state. There was almost $183 billion paid in the state in a given year, and almost $83 billion of those dollars were paid to people who have participated in our education and workforce system. You go to the next slide. And this, again, just shows you the spans across of all of our industry sectors where our education and workforce participants are working. And you can see it's over 65% of all workers in our trade, transportation, and utilities have been participants of our workforce system. And you can see the various education and health services, almost 65%. A huge amount of our industry employment is being driven by investment in the state's education and workforce system. Now we're going to, if you go to the next slide. So now we're going to kind of flip back to our performance on our apprenticeship program and show you how it fits into this larger scale. We worked with our NCWorks Commission, that is our State Workforce Investment Board, where we work with them under, we are mandated to partner in working with them to develop and establish and improve and enhance workforce performance in the state. And we have been working with them for the last couple of years to develop analysis down to the specific programmatic level. And apprenticeship was one of 16 different workforce programs that we analyzed. We utilized a cohort design. We looked at 2 cohorts, those people who were participating in 2009-10 and those who were participating in 10-11. And we looked across a wide variety of workforce programs. And of course, when you have a diversity of workforce program, everybody has their own definition of exiter or completion. And so we had to come up with a common definition to cut across all of these. So it was, the definition utilized in these analysis were people who participated in 1 year and who were not participating in the next year in the same program. And you'll see we have data on the employment and wages and also the further participation in additional education and workforce programs. If we go to the next slide, please. So here's just a high level of looking at our NCWorks apprenticeship participants, and you can see that over the time period, we've been following them for over 4 years, that their average wage increases from about $33,000 in the year that they're at $33,000 and change, all the way up to just under $40,000 4 years after. When we match it to, and the employment here that we're talking about is only that employment which is covered by the state UI system, which is still, we process in North Carolina about 4 million wage records a quarter. It's a pretty expansive amount of employment data. But there are some holes in the data, which, and one of the challenges that we see with apprenticeship is trying to tap into the data that is very critical, as Pam talked about. Some of the challenges we have is the holes of those working for either in the military or on military bases, which we're trying to leverage the FENS system to see what we can do to advocate for that, but there are some limitations on its expansive use for state level initiatives. If you go to the next slide, you can see here, this is just shows you the relationship between the post-employment in North Carolina and the average wage. So even 4 years after participation, we're finding almost 70% of the apprentices from that cohort employed in North Carolina, the average wage was just under $40,000. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the same table for the NCWorks apprenticeship cohort from the 10-11, and again, we're seeing some significant wages, over almost 41,000 and change 3 years after. So you've also seeing some impacts of the economy picking up, is what I always say. We went through a pretty big downturn, and it impacted a lot of our workforce programs, and it impacted our employment extensively. But we're still at 3 years later, about 70% of, just under 70% of the apprentices employed in the state. I want to talk a little bit of also the cross-match data that you see enrolled in UNC and enrolled in our community college system and enrolled in other workforce programs in general. We are able to, because of our rich repository, is to match across a wide variety of resources, and one of them is we have data from our university system, so we can look at our people enrolled, and then of course, as Pam said, she's got a great collaboration with our community college system, and you can see even 3 years after participation, almost 37% of those apprentices who were in the 10-11 year are still enrolled in our community college system 3 years later. So I wrote some notes as we were talking, as you all were talking earlier, about some more of the analysis that would really probably help is to not only just look at the enrollment in the programs, but how many of them ended up with academic credentials in addition to the apprentice credentials that they are receiving. We also are able to also match to our UI data and look at some of these people, obviously, you can see that a small percentage probably got laid off at some point because they were actually drawing unemployment insurance benefits. And then we have a number of, across all of our, so what percentage of people did we not find through any of our resources. Doesn't mean that they're not in the state, and it doesn't mean that they're not in the working in the state. It's just, were we able to find them across all of our various resources that we have within our common follow-up system. So if you could go to the next slide. Again, here's just the same graphic for that next cohort. You can see the rising wages over time, which is great, and then fairly level, being able to find them within the UI wage file in the state. The next slide. So going forward, Pam and I have been meeting in the last couple of weeks to talk about what other types of data can we utilize from the system and how we can help drive some of the things that we're doing in apprenticeship and what we're doing with our enhancement to our workforce data quality system, which we call the Common Follow-Up System. Our goals are to expand the level of data and detail of data that we have been getting from our contributors, and then to do more detailed analysis that will be expansive and allow us to answer even broader questions. Some of the things that we see that we can do with our apprenticeship data is more detailed analysis down, since we do have the occupation that they're being trained in. What are the long-term outcomes from those different types of occupations, and what are the wage progressions within specific occupations? And then Pam and I have spoken recently. She's very interested in trying to figure out how we could utilize all of this data to really do a return on investment so that we can show the payoffs not only for the state but also for the employers themselves. Can you go to the next slide? I wanted to also give you some links to some of the other informational products that we have been putting out from our Common Follow-Up System. The Measuring the Performance of North Carolina's Workforce Development System, our three reports that we've done with our NCWorks Commission, looking at the employment and wages of a variety of workforce programs. We are also mandated here to do an evaluation report, which we did further evaluation on outcomes of a wide variety of programs across our workforce system and education partners. It's a pretty lengthy report. And then we have also, through the use of our Workforce Data Quality Initiative and state funding, developed an information delivery tool called the NC Tower, which gives up to 10 years of employment and wage outcomes it currently contains information from our 58 community colleges and our universities. Go to the next slide. So that's really the big overview of how we have been. Pam gave you a great overview of how we operate the NCWorks apprenticeship in the state of North Carolina, and then the things that we are doing with workforce data in the state and how we're trying to integrate all of the great data from our apprenticeship program and our workforce data quality initiative grant. So that's what we have today.
Thank you so much, Pam and Betty. So next I would like to introduce Deb, who's going to give us the employer perspective on apprenticeship, which I think is really going to add something quite valuable to this webinar. It's just a different perspective that we don't hear from a lot. So take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you on behalf of Precor and the Guilford Apprenticeship Partners. The Guilford Apprenticeship Partners began in 2015 as an apprenticeship partnership located in Guilford County, North Carolina. We knew that we could not afford to wait and needed to create a pipeline of workers with high demand skills. The goal of the GAP program is to offer technical career opportunities to high school students and employment after graduation. In return, the sponsoring companies obtain highly skilled employees to fit their technical needs. We started out with well over 30 interested employers and ended up with the 6 that we have listed here as committed partners, which as I look back was a good number to launch the program. We spent about 6 months exploring strategies so that the apprenticeship program met the needs of the employers. There were many discussions and decisions on what would be the list of apprenticeship occupations. A critical component was partnering with key sponsor organizations, as I have listed here, and building the core components of our apprenticeship program. There was lots of education for everyone involved. Basically, we were learning as we were doing. We visited other apprenticeship programs throughout the state, including Apprenticeship 2000, Siemens, NC-TAP. And as Pam mentioned, I participate on a subcommittee of the NCWorks Apprenticeship Council. The success of this program will allow our apprenticeship group to grow throughout the county. Duplicating our knowledge and experience will lead to the development of partnerships throughout the state. Advanced slide, please. Partner companies will provide on-site apprenticeships in various technical trades, including welding, machining, tool and die, and engineering, to name a few. The 8,000-hour program spans 3 to 4 years of training. Upon graduation, students will earn an associate's degree in manufacturing technology and will be awarded a journeyman's certificate by the North Carolina Department of Commerce. We chose a program where the apprenticeships complete a required number of hours in on-the-job training and related instruction. We also built in some flexibility in the related instruction and training model. We chose a college credit program and with industry certification. High school juniors and seniors considered for an apprenticeship with us should have completed courses while in high school, such as algebra, calculus, and your basic math courses, as well as any related hands-on courses such as welding, HVAC, automotive, drafting, engineering, or computer applications. Students are also required to have a minimum unweighted 2.5 GPA. Apprentices will receive increases in pay as their skills and knowledge increase. By having a progressive wage scale, I believe, as Pam had mentioned, will help reward and motivate our apprentices as they advance through their training. Each employer is registered or has registered their apprenticeship program with the state. Advanced slide, please. This slide reflects our journey that we have traveled this year in launching our apprenticeship program. I don't think I can even count how many meetings we had to have with all the employers and the sponsor organizations before we ended up with our 6 employers and officially created the GAP partnership. Once we had a draft of our timelines, we started with educational meetings with the high school principals. It was key to have the principals on board before moving to the school and career counselor meetings. Believe it or not, the response was overwhelming and very positive. While there are 28 high schools in our county, we chose to visit 13, and we met well over 300 junior and senior students. Our employer open houses was an opportunity and a requirement for students to attend in order to apply for the program. Out of the 80 students who attended our 7 open houses, 49 applied and 35 were selected for the orientation. From orientation, 24 students have been selected, that being 12 juniors and 12 seniors, to attend the pre-apprentice program. We're hoping that all 24 students will eventually be selected for the apprenticeship program. Advance slide, please. As you can see from this slide, there are many benefits. The skills shortage pervade all stages of manufacturing, from engineering to skilled production. This challenge will only grow as the demographics of our workforce drive boomer retirements, technological advances requiring higher level of training, and the education system continues to lack a focus on our CT and STEM education. We have a shortage of skilled labor, and the apprenticeship program is an opportunity for employers to establish a pipeline for our next generation of workers by growing our own talent. Manufacturers need to be a part of the solution, offering clear guidance on expectations of performance and delivering a roadmap for success. The bottom line is that in order to compete in the global marketplace, manufacturers need a skilled talent pipeline. Advance slide, please. In this age of data-driven decision-making, data is foundational to the success of the apprenticeship program. Whether discussing student achievement, program monitoring, education funding, accountability, or any other education-related conversation, data is at the center of discussion. Monitoring the program performance and key metrics is essential to our success. Our data collection has been a challenge. It's been very easy to take for granted that performance monitoring would happen without oversight and accountability. Lessons learned: to definitely thoroughly plan data tracking out, identify what kinds of data is needed, who's going to track, what system are we going to use. We currently track just using an Excel spreadsheet. Nothing wrong with that, it's just our way of starting. As the employer group grows, however, I think this is an area of opportunity. Some of the key metrics to track: actual versus planned comparison of the program timeline. Were we on time? Did we have to adjust? And yes, we did. Actual versus planned comparison of the program budget. Each partner put in $1,000, and basically we spent everything. Actual versus planned comparison of the program's ability to deliver the number of apprentices required. We were very concerned whether or not we could get the number of apprenticeships to meet the college education requirements of 8 students to start our program. We have 24. We feel very comfortable that we'll be able to meet and exceed that number. Turnover rate of the program versus normal attrition. So far, through the program, we haven't lost anybody. An overall assessment of whether or not the program will address the specific needs for each employer. So far, everybody's satisfied. Our support organizations can contribute to data collection, so be sure to partner with your organizations like we wonderfully have here with NC State. Ultimately, collecting data, assessing our performance, and continuously improving to meet the changing needs of employers is important and key to our program expansion. Other employers are going to be asking for our data, so they can make decisions on whether or not to join. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Deb. Next slide, please. We're going to move on to the question and answer period, and we have about a half an hour for this. If we don't use it, we will let you all go back early, but we have a lot of really great questions. So if you have any more questions, please submit them using the questions box. Next slide, please. So the first question I'm actually going to take, we were asked if RAPIDS or state longitudinal databases are open to public access, and the answer to that is no. Neither is accessible to the general public. RAPIDS is accessible to the Department of Labor, and state longitudinal databases vary. Some do provide certain data, usually aggregate and definitely stripped of personally identifiable information to, say, researchers, but each state has its own process about how to do this. The Workforce Data Quality Campaign actually recently released a report about it, which is on our website. So if you're interested in that, please take a look. Okay, next question. We had a couple questions about specific data, which, as I mentioned, can be hard to answer because we don't have access to it. But looking about the number of underrepresented minorities in apprenticeship, Katie, do you have anything to add about minorities in apprenticeship, even though we don't have the specific data about the number?
Sure. So one thing that I will point out is that late at the end of 2015, Department of Labor put out a notice of proposed rulemaking updating the equal employment opportunity regs for the first time in 30 years as they apply to apprenticeships. So we're expecting the final rule to come out on these sometime late summer or early fall. And these EEO regs would require updated processes for planning and engaging underrepresented populations. Actually, in the notice of proposed rulemaking, there was some good aggregate data about the underrepresentation of people of color and women in apprenticeships. They also offered important data that showed that especially in some of the most highly paid occupations of apprenticeship, so like an electrician or others with the highest wages, that women and people of color are particularly underrepresented and also have lower completion rates of apprenticeships. So we do know that this data indicates an underrepresentation of certain populations, and that Department of Labor, through their notice of proposed rulemaking, is seeking to help expand access and make it easier for sponsors as well to know what their responsibilities are, and as well as helping them to develop the kind of processes that can work for employers to track and to engage these populations, so that starting and expanding apprenticeship programs really works for both underrepresented populations and the kind of employers that are being targeted as well.
Okay, Katie, we have another question for you. How can we find out about apprenticeship grant opportunities in your state? We have a couple of questions about these upcoming grant opportunities.
Sure. So the first place that many of the state grants are required to, that I mentioned, some of the state accelerator grants and leader grants, if your state is a state apprenticeship agency, that agency is often required to be the lead under those grants, so I'd be in contact with those folks. If your state is a Department of Labor, Office of Apprenticeship state, then you can be in touch with the local and regional representatives. The Department of Labor and Office of Apprenticeship also have a great website with all of their grant opportunities. And as I think some of our questioners pointed out, many of the grant opportunities, the American Apprenticeship grants, and we anticipate upcoming grants, are required to track some of the data that we have been talking about. So AAI grantees are required to make some of the demographic information available to DOL, as well as provide access to some of the information on the return on investment. So we are seeing Department of Labor expand the kind of data that they're trying to track through these targeted grant programs. And folks who are interested in participating both at the state level and in some of the contracts should pay attention to ETA website, as well as sign up for National Skills Coalition and WDQC's listserv and our blog, because we often and we will be highlighting as these funding opportunities become available.
Thanks, Katie. So our next question is for Pam. Can you talk to the process to register an apprenticeship program in North Carolina?
I can. So basically we have 8 apprenticeship consultants throughout the state that are part of our core team. They are located in local regions that we refer to as our 8 prosperity zones throughout the state of North Carolina. Oftentimes we will get a referral from either a community college system partner or our workforce board telling us that the employer is having trouble attracting a skilled workforce. We will send a local consultant over to that employer. They will work very closely to identify the skill gaps. They will determine where they're going to get the related instruction for the program. Our consultants will actually write the program for them and register the program for them in North Carolina. And then we maintain a local, a statewide database actually that monitors and audits all of those programs. So that's basically the 30,000 view foot. And if you want more information, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email. I can actually connect you with our apprenticeship team, because that's one of my 3 teams that I lead in the state of North Carolina, and we would be happy to give you more information.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is for Deb. We have actually a number of questions talking about youth apprenticeships and the barriers that employers may perceive about having younger people in the workplace. Can you talk about how you've overcome those barriers?
That is true. That was probably the biggest concern for most of the employers as we originally started out, 17 versus 18-year-old. And that's the critical point of working with your registered apprenticeship program with your state. And I think Pam also can address this. You know, all the employers did work with their local insurance carriers and such, but with the NC Apprenticeship Council, employing 17-year-olds was not a problem. We actually, for the pre-apprentice program, are going to employ our 17-year-olds through a temporary agency, and then once they become apprentices, we're going to then employ them as a full-time employer, or employee, I should say. But because we're part of the registered program and the apprentice will be part of the registered program, we will be fine. Of course, that doesn't preclude that we must not put them in occupations that are highly hazardous. And I think, Pam, if you could speak to those highly hazardous areas from a Department of Commerce, I think that will help some of these employers alleviate that concern.
Yes, so we see a lot of concern with things like electricians, power line technicians, some of the construction trades, firefighters. I would say those are more hazardous, as well as like chemical plant operators. So some of those are prohibitive for youth apprenticeship and power generation equipment. So those are our more risky occupations in regards to youth apprenticeship. So we get a lot of concerns about insurance and OSHA and questions like that with our youth apprentices.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is for Pam and Betty. So can you provide any examples of the types of apprenticeship training that have been done in North Carolina? And are there any specific job skills and career paths that you're working on developing?
So I think the most recent is in mechatronics engineering. So that's a mechanical, electrical, electronic technician all built into one. And so several of our community colleges have actually started mechatronics engineering programs to basically accommodate our mostly youth apprentices. So we right now in North Carolina have about 40 people in the mechatronics engineering apprenticeship program. And then also another emerging sector is computer numeric control machinists. So we're seeing a lot of companies that are having a lot of difficulty getting skilled machinists, and we've started a lot of machining apprenticeships with our youth programs as well. Betty?
I think in North Carolina, as we were talking about, that we have a pretty diverse group of occupations. I know when I first started dealing with some of the data, we have you think of it more of just kind of construction trades, kind of where I had thought of it when I first came, but it really is a wide variety of occupations. From even our programs have a lot even with our public safety and firefighters and things that you wouldn't necessarily think were apprentice kind of training as opposed to kind of construction. And it's a pretty diverse group and across all of a lot of skilled trades and a lot of different industries. And so we see it, and even when we look at the data across a wide variety of industries, when we match some of the data to look at the industries that they're working in, and it's a pretty diverse group of occupations that Pam and her team are working with.
Thank you. Okay. Katie, we have a question for you. Is there any alignment between WIOA and registered apprenticeship?
Yes, there's. For folks on the phone who may not be as familiar, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act passed a couple years ago, and it legislates and regulates the workforce development system in our country. And the workforce development system has for a long time worked with the registered apprenticeship system. One of the goals under WIOA was to help improve this alignment. So some of the major increases in some of the alignment come through, so the eligible training provider list now includes registered apprenticeship programs if they want to be included. WIOA also promotes work-based learning and apprenticeship to meet employer needs by expanding access to on-the-job training to support apprenticeship programs. One of the largest increases in alignment was also in the focus on youth. So under WIOA, 75% of funds must now be used for out-of-school youth, and funding under this can be used for work-based learning and apprenticeship. It also requires 20% of all youth funds to be focused on work experience, which in the past has largely been captured by some summer job programs, but under WIOA, they're really focusing on expanding this access to ensure that youth are getting opportunities like youth apprenticeship and work-based learning in order to help earn on-the-job training opportunities.
Thanks, Katie. The next question we have from the audience is for Deb. And the question is, does your program operate in any other states, and are you planning to expand it?
Currently, we are just in the Guilford County in North Carolina, but our intent is to expand anywhere and everywhere. We've done a lot of research. We've talked to a lot of different agencies, and as far as I'm concerned, this can be duplicated.
Thanks.
If this is Pam, I'll just mention that we do have 11 other groups like the Guilford Apprenticeship Partners throughout the state of North Carolina, and many more coming on board.
Awesome. So Pam, while you're on, let's keep you here. We got a question that said that they heard through the grapevine that college tuition is free for registered apprenticeship programs in North Carolina. Is that true? And if so, can you talk a little bit more about it?
So we have a pretty unique program in North Carolina called Career and College Promise. And that is legislation that says if you are a high school student and you enroll in the community college, that's referred to as dual enrollment. And as long as you are in high school, you can take community college classes for free. So that is a true statement. The only thing the students would be responsible for would be their books. So their tuition would actually be waived at the state level. We're working with our legislature to really grow that throughout the apprenticeship program so that once they graduate from high school, we're very hopeful that they will propose legislation in this short session that says they will continue with Career and College Promise through the end of their apprenticeship, and that would offset the cost of related instruction for the employers. So we're pretty excited about that.
Thanks. Another question for Pam and Betty. You mentioned looking into doing a return on investment report. Do you have any sort of timeline for when you might complete that?
So I've been nagging Betty about that for a while. So she and I are definitely going to carve out some time in the next 6 months to get that written, because I think it's a really critical piece for our employers, especially those who are kind of on the fence about apprenticeship and they think it's too expensive of a solution for them. So I think time is of the essence for us to get a study done, but we want it to be a good quality study. And Betty can speak to that.
Yeah. And one of the things, while we talk a little bit about the data and the challenge, we talked about the good things for data, but there's also, we're confronted sometimes, especially with apprenticeship, because most of the data that we're getting is coming directly from the employer, and there's concerns about giving PII data, especially the Social Security number, which then presents its own challenges when you don't have that data, right, to link it back. We see it as, Pam and I have talked, and it's going to only show how good apprenticeship is in North Carolina if we can show the benefit to employers, right, and then also the investment. I think our legislators also want to know what's the investment they make and the money that they're investing in the program itself and supporting the work of our apprenticeship consultants and registering these programs. So it's a pretty critical piece, but we do have some data challenges that we're going to have to figure out how we do a really good ROI study and deal with some of the data limitations that we quite often have. So, but we're hopeful that we can we can do it. And we can also, I think the thing that we have here is also the tie-in with, also show that the connection to receiving other credentials, even if they are the academic credentials that we have from our community college system, which will show benefit for both the NCWorks side of the house and also the community college, and what the benefit is of the programs there. So hopefully we'll get it. We should be able to get it going in a couple of weeks here.
Betty, our audience is really fascinated with this ROI study, and we have a question about how you put together data from employers for the study, and any metrics that you plan to use, and any plans to standardize your data definitions across the employers.
Yeah, you know, Pam was sharing with me the other day that she's done, she did some training in ROI, so we have to put our heads together to come up with a really good method. You know, we can look at, there are ways that we can look at the relationship of apprenticeship to all. If we know the employers, we can look at the relationship of what the apprentices are being paid compared to all of their employees by the linkages of the data, and then in specific industries. So we do have a lot of things that we've got to figure out about. Okay, so how do you take into account not only the investment of what the legislature has put in the apprenticeship program, but also the investment that the employer is putting in, right? So they're making, while it's voluntary, it's still an agreement in terms of the contribution that they're doing on that job. So there's some of those data elements are going to have to be captured through, you know, interviews with some of the employers that we have. And if you've got anything else that you want to add, Pam.
So we do have some employers who are willing to participate in sort of a case study methodology. So I think if we could, you know, if we could do several, 3 to 5 employers that have rather large apprenticeship programs, that it wouldn't be a difficult thing to capture.
Deb, we have another question for you. Was the curriculum developed by employers for NC-GAAP, or was an existing curriculum used?
It was actually specifically designed for GAAP. We got together, and once we defined our occupational apprenticeship titles that we were going to do, we had from the community college our contact. He came and visited each and every employer, and we walked through our jobs, our manufacturing procedures. He went back and developed our curriculum so that it met everybody's needs and had flexibility. For example, as I needed a welder and somebody else needed a machinist, each student could participate as a group, but at the same respect, whether or not they got an extra certificate or what have you, it was flexible enough to meet the demands of each employer.
Okay. The questions have slowed down, and it's a lovely Thursday afternoon, at least here in DC. We have beautiful weather, so I'm going to answer one last question, and then we're going to end the webinar. So that last question is the Department of Labor working to move away from the RAPID system and to another database? And the answer to that question is not to our knowledge at this point in time. So thank you all so much for joining us. If we did not get to your question, we might send out an individual email to you after the webinar, or if we have a couple of questions that a lot of people ask, we might send out a document to the group. We will make the slides available online after, as well as a recording of this webinar. So please visit our websites, workforcedqc.org and nationalskillscoalition.org. Follow us on Twitter, and have a great afternoon. Thank you all. Bye.